All right, welcome back to the podcast. I am hanging out with Tim Truax. Did I get this pronunciation right?
You nailed it, man. First time.
Yeah. So CEO and chief podcaster at Pod Summit. And you also moonlight as a geologist, is that right? Or do I have that backwards?
Maybe a little bit backwards.
Yeah.
It's a career. It's the one that pays the bills is the geologist, geoscientist, and Pod Summit's become this new venture of, personal exploration, but also getting out there into the entrepreneurial world, which is something pretty new for me.
Yeah. And that's how we met. Is a mutual friend of ours kind of brought us all together for a beer. And, my podcast is called Let's Meet for Beer. So most things are done over a beer, which I think is always the best idea. So he met so that we could chat about Pod Summit and what your vision is for that. So let's just start there. What is Pod Summit? What is your vision? What's the purpose of it?
Yeah, Pod Summit fundamentally is about community for me. That's why I started podcasting, was to build a community around something that was important to me, and that's kind of the pop culture space. And I had this opportunity to purchase Pod Summit about 6 months ago, and it was this driving idea of how do I create something, a focal point for a much larger podcast community.
Yeah.
And the essence of that is in person, pulling together an event, conference, something that's scalable inside of the podcast space where I can pull on hobbyists or professional podcasters, industry, bring them all together underneath a single roof and let them interact, learn from one another, and really connect. Like that networking, that connection piece is the fundamental core of what we're trying to build with Pod Summit. And so there's organizations in the States and in Europe that do very similar things. And what we're trying to do here is find the voice and the vision for Canadian podcasting inside of Pod Summit.
So when you talk community, because I love, anytime you can build community in an authentic way, I think it's really important. So when you visualize a community within the podcast world, so it's people doing podcasts, right? So podcast hosts. Who else kind of belongs in that community in your vision?
I think it's anyone with a story to tell. I think that's what's so powerful about podcasting. It allows you to not only connect with people to tell their stories, but you're also telling your own personal story through the style of podcasting or who you're interacting with. And so really podcasting to me is about storytellers. It's about people that have something that they want to share with a population or share with someone that they feel can be impactful for other individuals, but they just don't have the ability to get their voice out there.
Right.
And podcasting is such a low barrier for entry when it comes to the tech and equipment and the ability to get it on and get it on a platform that can be heard, can be viewed. It's not like radio or broadcasting or television or even YouTube where there are some limitations based on the tech. It's almost as simple as Amazon, microphone, tell your story, get it out there. Now, there's some refinement to it, and there's some expertise that you gain as you go and to kind of really elevate your podcast. But to me, it is storytellers. That's who that community is. And whether that's an underserved community, whether that is someone that is driving towards trying to tell local stories about entrepreneurs or athletes, or someone that like myself that simply just love talking to friends about Star Wars and Marvel and all that, and just getting together and having a reason to come together, and then sharing that with a bigger population. So it's like I said, it's about storytelling.
Yeah. So so the first Pod Summit, that would be in Calgary, is that right?
Yeah. So we're dubbing it Pod Summit YYC 2024.
Okay.
And so we're trying to create a bit of a collaborative focal point here in the city. There's a lot of podcasters in Alberta, in Calgary, but even stretched out across Canada. And so what we're trying to do is have this as a Canadian first Pod Summit where it's essentially a conference, an event where it is focusing on Canadian podcasters. You get a little bit of it out in the Toronto, Ontario area, but because Canada's so big, you get these very isolated pockets of podcasters, and there's nowhere really for everyone to just come together. And that's what we're trying to build, is encourage kind of this podcast first, as we're calling it, and low barrier for entry. So whether you're a hobbyist, an aspiring podcaster, a storyteller, whatever it is, let's get everyone together and let's pull in some of the industry too, some of the people that are making the big business moves in that, and see what happens when you pull all these people underneath a single roof.
Yeah, I love that. So when you think about, because it's a I love the concept, but obviously when you're starting something new, especially when it's a conference or, in my day job, we do Alberta beer festivals. And so I always know that there's a great opportunity to lose a lot of money. And there's a lot of risk, right, that you're taking. So when you look at what you're doing with Pod Summit, what are kind of the major challenges that you see in that you have to overcome in order for this to be successful?
Yeah, like you said, the financial piece is always kind of the scarier piece of it, right? Because this is my first kind of entrepreneurial drive at something. I do come from a family of entrepreneurs. Both my parents are entrepreneurs. So I understand kind of the risk and what comes with that, the work that comes with it. But I would look at this as kind of the biggest risk here is the inability to get it out to a wider population. Because I think if we build something with the production level that we're targeting and with the vision that we have, it's not money driven. This is driven out of a passion. It's driven out of a desire to create something bigger.
Right.
I don't have huge fears. Like my biggest fear would be that no one knows about it. And so that's why I love coming on podcasts like this. And that's why I'm trying to reach out to as many people as possible, engage the Canadian podcast community on a very like almost personal level with it. Reaching out to individuals. This is about getting those people to come and then growing from there. We're gonna make mistakes in the first one. Luckily my wife, who's the CEO of the company, is an event planner by background. She planned a lot of concerts during her early days in and around Stampede Roundup, Oxford Stomp, these type of. So she's got the execution capability to do these big events. But what it comes down to is this is relatively new still, even for Canada to do something like this. And so it's bringing all that together and getting the execution of the first one, just getting our legs underneath us, figuring out what we did wrong, figuring out what we did right, and then building from there.
And I think it's like anything, you have to kind of do it once to kind of get a context of like, okay, what does this community look like? Like physically seeing, all these people in the same room, like what are their questions? What are their curiosities? Like where are they kind of leaning? So, and the nice thing is when you're going in year one, there is no necessarily frame of reference. So it's kind of like, okay, doing it is a success, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, that's exciting. It's cool that it's going to be in Calgary too, because then I can just walk over there.
Exactly, man.
So personally, you're podcasting. So you've published over 400 podcasts. It's called The Nerd Room.
Yeah.
So why did you, what was your initial reason for starting a podcast?
Yeah, it comes back to that word community, which is kind of going to be a common thread through a lot of this stuff is I went through my whole life. I'm a giant nerd. I love toy collecting and the Marvel films, Star Wars films, loved it all my life. And I got to a point where I didn't have any friends that were into it the same way I was.
Right.
And I ended up making a lot of friends through the podcast that had that common love and passion for this nerd environment, this nerd ecosystem. And I said, well, why don't we try to build something a bit bigger? And so a buddy of mine got together. We just dropped a mic in front of us and just started talking about this and sharing our experiences. And that community grew. And it became a point where we said, this podcast is really about the bridge between going to the movies and having like the fandom experience. We're meant to be the low barrier for entry where you want to learn a little bit and then you get to the next level. If you want to deep dive, there's all kinds of deep dive podcasts. We are like, let's jump in. You went and saw the latest Star Wars movie. You want to hear a little bit more about it, you come to us.
Yeah.
And if you want to experience more, we can guide you and direct you. But it was really about us expressing ourselves and finding a group of people that share that same passion and love that we didn't have in our day-to-day.
Right. And I like that because sometimes people get so deep into their whatever their nerdy passion is that it's like, where does someone enter into that world, right? Like, where does someone ask the stupid questions? Yeah. Like, if I don't know how to speak fluid Klingon, am I even allowed to be in this world? Like, you know what I mean? Like, there needs to be that entry point, and no matter what it is, right? Yeah. There needs to be that entry point where, like, hey, there's no dumb questions, or maybe there are dumb questions, but we won't make fun of you for asking them, kind of thing. You know what I mean?
That's exactly it, and that's kind of translated over to Pod Summit as well, where we're kind of just inviting everyone. We want this to be a low barrier for entry, but there's going to be scalable pieces of it where if you're a beginner or an aspiring podcaster, you can come in and ask those questions.
Yeah.
And you can talk to professionals. You can talk to people that have been podcasting for a year. It doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
And then there's going to be that piece where, okay, you're a professional podcaster. You've been doing shows and you want to move up and scale your podcast to something bigger. There's going to be those people to talk to there. So it's all about making it accessible, but also giving you avenues to progress wherever you're at in the podcasting space.
And then I love that because it makes me think of, like, I used to have a little sports store, and I always wanted to make sure that people felt comfortable no matter what their level was. You go into some stores, say, like, you go into, like, whatever it is, and they're, you know, maybe it's, I'll pick on fly fishing, for example, and it's like, you know, you ask this particular question and it's kind of like the person just kind of sighs, like, you don't know how to do that. And it's like, no, but I want to be able to come to a place where I can feel comfortable, because what I want to do is learn how to do that. And you should be the person that helps me get along. And some people get that and some people don't, right? Where it's just like, no, this isn't, you know, a place for elite people, elitists or whatever. This is a place for people who are genuinely curious to kind of come together and kind of learn together, right?
Yeah, and that's exactly it. It's even like, for another example, it's like if you've ever walked into a comic book shop, like that. If you're coming out of a Marvel movie or super hyped and you walk into a comic book shop, it can be very intimidating, overwhelming. Like, that sounds odd.
No.
But you can go in and be like, I don't even know where to start.
Because whatever your comment is, if it isn't completely on point and nuanced and like, then they're gonna like, dude, you don't even know shit compared to me. You know what I mean? It's just like this like puffing of chest.
Yeah. Well, like it's like even in the podcasting space too. It's like even from a listener perspective, every podcast is someone's first podcast. Like, whatever you put out there, someone's going to be listening to the first time. So there's those niche podcasts that you go to if you're, you know, you have all this experience in a particular area, and that's what's wonderful about podcasts. You can find those.
Yeah.
But there's some shows where people are just tuning in for the first time, and they don't want to feel overwhelmed when they plug in, when they're trying to just get over the hump of something or get into something or express themselves in a different way. They want to feel welcomed into something.
100%.
People want to be part of a community.
Yeah. So when you mentioned the comic book store, so a record store is the same thing, right? So anytime that you go into a record store, I'm generalizing, of course, and you go to, and so you buy the record, you bring the record, there's silent judgment going on, right? It's just like, oh my God, you don't have this Dire Straits record already? What a loser. Yeah. So the one exception, and it was just funny because I went and bought a record one day, and it was like a comic record, Newhart. It was like from like probably the 60s or 70s. And it was just funny because the guy didn't know how to react to like because no one has like, you know, like comic records from the 70s. So he couldn't be like, so it was kind of like a glitch in the system. He's just like, fuck, I don't know what, like, okay, cool. You're buying Bob Newhart records. That's pretty random. But no, I know what you mean. It's like anywhere where nerdism exists, there's like the elitism exists with it too, right? So to be approachable to me is always the right play. Yeah. And then because that's when you get people being themselves, people being curious, and that's where the fun is, right?
Yeah, exactly, man. Like when you get to that point in time, you have so much fun in whatever space that you've wandered into, whether it's sporting or comics or whatever. And then you can just be yourself. Like that's a hard thing for some people, especially with social media and all that, right? They're trying to be something. Yeah. But being able to just be yourself is kind of a unique thing now, where you don't have to put on a presentation or shows. You can just wander into like your comfort zone. And that's like even the nerd room itself. Like the idea is that it's a place that you come to just be yourself, to enjoy, to share. Like that's like in the naming of it all. It's like everyone has that space, whether it is an office or whatever, man cave or she shed, doesn't matter. Everyone's got that space, and that's what it kind of represents.
I like that. So, and in that though is, you know, because I found it hard when I first started podcasting, because part of podcasting for me was, you know, trying to find my voice and trying to talk, like what are my thoughts and how do I articulate them, and you know what stories am I interested in. And so it took me a long time to even like release my first podcast. Like I was like nervous, and I hate the sound of my own voice. And so there's all these like things going on for you, you have your full-time career. And then you're doing this to begin with as something that you were just doing as a hobby and for fun. And did you have any personal challenges when you were first, releasing your podcast that you kind of had to overcome? Like, was there any of that? Like, ooh, I hate my own voice, or what if, somebody from work hears and what are they going to think? Or like, was there any voices in your head that you kind of had to fight?
Oh yeah. Like almost every time we recorded, like I had this thing where I say to new podcasters, I say 100 episodes. That's how long it takes you to find your voice. And if you're not experimenting with style and co-hosts and how you're experiencing these things, you're never going to find your voice. If you decide very early on that you're going to be podcasting in this way, in this manner to this people, you're going to have a difficult time finding your voice because you're trying to be something that you're really not. And I always, like 100 episodes is what it took me. And the things that always kind of scared me was, one, you kind of hit the nail on the head. Is like, what if someone that I know hears this and know that I do it? And it was very cathartic almost when I finally said I podcast, and I podcast about this, right? It was just kind of like a release.
This should be like an AA meeting for Podcast Anonymous.
Sometimes, and it's hard because if you're in a niche space, it's a bit more difficult, I think, to talk to people about it, because I find even in the nerd space, you get two reactions. So I have a room in my basement, it's got like toys and all this kind of stuff. You get two reactions. You get the, oh my God, this is amazing, and like, oh. Like those are literally there's no in between. It's like, oh, you spend your money and time on this? Yeah. And some people react like that with podcasts, like, oh, you podcast? Like that's okay, cool. I hope you enjoy that. Yeah. And then other people are like, amazing. What is, like, tell me the title. What's your favorite episode? What do you, like, how did you get into it? And so you get the inquisitive minds and you get the people that are just kind of gloss over it. And so it's always that fear of being vulnerable, because as soon as you turn on the microphone and start talking to people or start talking about the thing you love, you drop that comfort and you become vulnerable, and you speak and you get excited, and the tone and cadence of your voice changes based on what you're talking about. Yeah. And that, like, being vulnerable is hard for people. It was hard for me at the start too. Totally. Yeah. And I'd say, like, that's probably the most difficult part about podcasting is, one, being yourself, and two, being vulnerable on the mic, because that's how you also connect with the audience, with the listeners, is being real and being vulnerable to whatever it is you're talking about.
And I think if you're not being real, for me anyway, I would think that's why it takes so long to find your voice, is because you're trying to find that authenticity. Because if you're not looking for that, then I don't know what the purpose of doing podcasts are, right? Like it should be to express yourself. One of the things that I really like is, when I went through a phase of my life where, I wasn't necessarily curious, in that I wasn't really asking questions, right? You would just kind of like go do your day to day. What I find with podcasting is it really encourages curiosity, and it's just like the more you talk to people, the more you ask questions, the more it just kind of like feeds on itself. You know what I mean? Do you find that as well?
Oh yeah, like the curiosity piece of podcasting is one of the most important, especially as a host, because you find yourself all of a sudden down these paths where you're like, how did I even get here? Yeah. But I love where I am. Yeah. And the only way you're getting there is through curiosity, and it's through asking questions. Yeah. And it's putting yourself out there to ask guests to come on your show, to get out there and ask different questions or different people about what they do, how they do it. And I've even found this experience with Pod Summit and networking off the back of that to be this like surprising, wonderful piece of kind of this journey that I'm on right now, is that I've met you, and I've met so many people that are all like-minded and willing to discuss and share and talk. And that's one thing I love about podcasters, is they are so curious. Everyone wants to hear the story. Everyone wants to hear where you're at. And if you can impart a little bit of wisdom or some insight, then all the better. Yeah. But I think it's just having that community to just pull on, and podcasters are great people because they are inherently curious and ask questions.
Okay, so not to contradict myself, but I'm curious about this too, because sometimes there's benefits. So for example, you talk about community, and in my day-to-day world of Alberta beer festivals, we we're very lucky to be a part of the beer, the craft beer community, craft spirits community. And so I've been lucky enough to watch a lot of these people build their brands and become successful, and go through their own challenges and stuff like that. I often wonder, why do people, you see people helping people and it's not obvious why they should be helping them, in terms of they're not thinking about it. What's in it for me as a podcaster, for example? Could you look at it and say, well, the more podcasts there are, then the less ears there are potentially on my podcast. So therefore I shouldn't be promoting community. I should be just focused on promoting my own individual podcast. Mm-hmm. So where do you see the benefit of a community outweighing your maybe individual interests?
Yeah, I think with almost any community, the benefit is in sharing. And I think if you're solely focused on promoting yourself and monetizing your podcast, and if I don't even think that can be your why, that's kind of maybe a result down the way. But I think most people get into podcasting as their why because they want to be a part of something bigger, or they want to tell a story. And I think that inherently we kind of all benefit from the success of the podcaster next to us.
Right.
They can impart a little wisdom. There's lots of podcasts out there about businesses, and I've been on this big kick of just digging into different business podcasts, just trying to listen and take like a grain of insight from these guys.
Yeah.
And I think that is so important in these communities, is that we're learning from one another. If you're singularly focused, I think you're going to fizzle. You're going to find yourself being like, podcasting itself is very lonely sometimes, where you find yourself maybe a little isolated and you can't find exactly the community that you're looking for. And you're producing episodes and you're dumping them out, and you don't have the ability to have that immediate reaction that, say, someone performing live on stage does. You can't say something and then get a reaction and then, oh, I'm going to tug on that thread.
Yeah.
You're kind of just speaking out into the world, and you don't get that feedback sometimes at all,
right, on
particular things. And so I think you have to rely a bit on that community to provide that feedback, or if nothing else, be able to kind of compare yourself to and say, what are they doing that's a little different? And they seem to be successful, or they're having more fun at the mic.
Right.
Why am I not having fun at the mic? Why am I treating this like it's a job, or I'm reading a script? Like, no, let's just go with the flow. So I think you need that. And I think you need that across all of life, like even parenting or whatever. You need to be able to like share experiences, because I think that collectively makes us all better.
So one of the things you said, so for me personally, sometimes when I'm doing a podcast, the reason why I feel like I need to be prepared to some degree is because sometimes I've had a guest where I'm thinking, okay, this person will be easy, they're going to carry the load, and then they end up being really hard. And then other times I think, oh, this person is going to be painful, and then they're really awesome. And so I'm like, okay, I have to have some level of preparation, so at least I have a thread that I can kind of go on. What's your preparation when you do a podcast?
Well, I do with the Nerd Room. It's almost none.
Okay.
Like it's kind of the day-to-day living. Like I'm in that environment. I'm following the movies. I'm following the information, the news, the things that are coming out. I'm reading books, whatever. Yeah. So it's kind of, we just get on and talk, because that is just our living experience. And so with the launch of Pod Summit, I also launched the podcast experience, which is kind of just a podcast that's associated with Pod Summit. And the idea there is just to engage podcasters, amplify and tell stories. And with that one, I think there is a necessity to do some background work. You got to kind of understand about what type of podcaster they are. You have to understand about even if they have a business associated with it, or you have to also listen to a couple of their episodes, right? You have to understand who the person is that you're interviewing. And so I would say, if on me, the spectrum of almost no preparation, just like flipping on the mic, to, I would say I'd probably put an hour or two into it, not including podcast listening. Like I'll go and pop one at the gym if I have someone coming up in the next couple of weeks. I'll listen to 3 or 4 of their episodes if I'm not a consistent listener, get a feel of vibe for how they are. And then that also helps, like you're saying, structure a bit about the amount of talking that you feel like you have to do, how much interjection you do, because you don't want the dead space and all that kind of in between time. You want it to feel like a natural conversation that doesn't have, 3-minute pauses in the middle when you're trying to think of what to say.
Totally. So for you, do you how hard do you edit your podcast, and what's that process look like for you? Because that's such a learning curve, and it has been for me. But for you, what's kind of your process in terms of packaging your podcast?
Yeah, I would say I do relatively minimal edits. I try to leave the conversation as a conversation. And so I generally don't take out a lot of the ums and ahs, because the idea and the construction of the discussion is meant to feel like you could be sitting in the room across from us. And I never want it to feel like like a sitcom. Where you're like, there's no way people talk like this in real life.
I think we had this conversation, didn't we?
We did,
Yeah,
because
when we met.
You watch Friends or Seinfeld or any modern...
No, I remember my wife used to watch Gilmore Girls,
Yes,
and I was
exactly,
just like, they're like, you can't think that quickly. Like the way they were conversing was just like, I'm like, yeah, they're very smart people, but like, to have that retort.
No one, there might be a handful of people on planet Earth that are like that.
Yeah.
But no one is actually like that, where you can actually respond in real time with book facts. It's just not possible.
Right. Yeah.
And it doesn't seem authentic to me.
Right.
So the only thing I do try to edit when I do edit, because I do most of our stuff remotely. My co-host right now for the Nerd Room, he lives in Japan.
Okay.
And so we do remote recording. And all I try to do sometimes is shorten some of the gaps to make it feel like it's not recorded online. So I tighten up the whole podcast.
Yeah.
And sometimes that means taking out half a second here, quarter of a second there, to just make it feel like you're responding in real time. Because there's always going to be a little bit of lag, and you can't take visual cues from people as much when you're recording remotely. And so the natural body language isn't there as prolific as you would, you and I sitting in the room.
Yeah.
And so when it comes to editing, I just tighten the whole thing up. But I don't generally take out a lot of the language. I'll do a little fact checking. If something is said that's really weird, I'm like, I don't know if this is true or not.
So if you're doing a podcast with Jeff Humphreys, you're doing a ton of fact checking.
All the fact checking,
you're
all of it.
Let's assume everything coming out of his mouth is bullshit.
I don't believe anything that is coming out of his mouth. No, just kidding. Jeff's a good guy.
Yeah, no, he's great. So one of the things, because when I first did it, I was no, I wouldn't say heavily edited, but I relied on the editing. Yeah. And so then what ended up happening was I felt like I wasn't necessarily fully present, because I knew I could, stop and be like, okay, let's ask that question again. So I almost do no editing, because then that allows me to make sure that I'm fully present in the, because if you've ever done, and this is years ago, I remember being on TV once, and you could tell that the person talking to me wasn't fully present. And that really bothered me. It was kind of like, as soon as the camera went on, then they were like, oh, hey, how are you? And it's kind of like, okay. And then as soon as it was off, they're like, hey, go. And they would walk away. And I just thought, I don't want that. I want to feel as into it as I possibly can. And so for me, it was like, let's get the editing out. Let's not edit so that it's just our conversation. Yeah. And I mean, the odd thing, if someone says something and they're like, my wife would be really mad if I was talking about my girlfriend on the podcast. We'll edit that, sure.
Yeah, there's always room for it, but like you said, you can't depend on it. You can't use it as a crutch to get over certain pieces of it all. And there's moments where you mess up the intro, and then okay, I'm just gonna redo that, and we'll just cut that piece out and go at it. But like you said, if you use it as a crutch, it's gonna hamper what you do and what the final product. It might sound better, but if it doesn't, to me, most podcasts, they need, especially if they're conversational, they have to sound like an actual conversation.
Yeah, that's always helpful. So outside of podcasting, you're a geologist. Are you one of those people that always kind of knew that that's where you were gonna end up? Or
it's, for me, it's been it's funny enough, I was back home. I grew up in Ontario, and so I was back home over the summer, and I pulled out this piece of paper. It was like a journal entry from school from 1994.
Yeah. And
it had written on it, it had two very, very key things in my life. One, it said, I like tuna, Still to this day, love tuna. Great protein.
That's good to know. It's good to document that too.
And yeah, as like a
Future self, just so you know, I really like tuna. It's awesome.
And then the other piece was it said I want to be a fossil geologist.
Yeah.
And that really comes off of the back of, if I'm going to be dead honest with you, Jurassic Park, 1993. Yeah. When I saw that movie, my absolute brain melted, and I said, I want to be. At that time, it was like a paleontologist. And then it evolved to fossil geologist. And then I actually went to school to be a geologist in Ottawa. And then I had a professor in my second year said, look, paleontology is great, but you can't make much money. And if you actually want to become a true paleontologist, you have to get on with an old paleontologist, wait till they die, and then you get his spot. And it's a very lonely, and you're not Alan Grant running around or whatever Chris Pratt's character was in Jurassic Park. You're not that guy.
Yeah.
And that's probably what I wanted to be.
Yeah, you're like, oh, shit.
Okay,
I'll be Indiana Jones then.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I want. I wanted the hat. I wanted like just run around and get chased by dinosaurs, I think. And then this prof said to me, well, why don't you go to Calgary? Like, go to the oil and gas industry. You can do similar stuff. You work with rocks the same age, like the Cretaceous period and all this kind of stuff. But you can actually make a living doing that, and you can have a family, and you don't have to, like some geologists spend their life in the bush running around northern Ontario looking for gold and whatever. And so that seemed much more appealing to me than, digging around in the dirt or sitting in a very quiet room in a museum for my whole life by myself. And so long story short, I always wanted to be a geologist, geoscientist, whatever you want to call me. And coming out here was really just a consequence of like, how do I frame my life up in a way where I can be successful, I can have a family, but I also can do something that I love.
Yeah. So in terms of, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'm always curious about this because most people that are geophysicists or geologists or in that kind of world, they grew up fascinated by rocks, right? Mm-hmm. I have brothers in that world, so it's just like, I was never like fascinated in the same way. But you want to talk about nerding out, like you guys nerd out about fucking rocks and stuff. Like it's like a pretty niche nerdism.
I think you can see that like how like the nerd theme through my whole life has existed well into my career. And
man,
it can get deep and dense, man.
Oh, we used to go to hockey school in Penticton, and my older brother would be like the whole way there, because he was in school at the time to become a geophysicist, and he'd be like explaining all the rocks and like the mountains. I was like, oh God, I don't fucking care at all. Like, I'm just like, how do I tell this guy that can beat the shit out of me if I don't tell? Anyway, one of the things that struck me though is anybody that I met in school, or like my brothers and stuff like that are in the industry, they always loved the world. They loved the mountains. They loved being out in nature, and so it's one of those things where I feel like and maybe I'm just totally wrong here, but there should be more of a connection between what oil and gas does and environmentalism, in terms of the people that are doing it do love the world. And I know that might sound to some people as like a complete contradiction, but you're talking about people who grew up loving the world, and they don't want to. I think one of the things you said is keep the leave the world better than you left it. I think that's the underlying mantra of a lot of the people in your industry, and I don't think that message gets across. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, it's a widely misbranded industry, I would say personally. Like it's an interesting topic to wade into, because you get people coming from all different angles, but like the industry itself, and like the geologists too, like they're very connected to the earth, and they're fascinated by, at least myself, and I can probably speak for quite a few geologists and geophysicists. You're fascinated by the puzzle that is hundreds of millions of years of earth and rock deposition, and how that all comes together, and it gives us oil and gas, like the thing that runs and powers our world. But fundamentally, we're connected to this, and we want to see a lot of this exploitation and exploration of oil and gas done in a responsible and sustainable way. And when I say misbranded, I would say like it's an industry that fundamentally depends on the earth, and it's about that sustainability and the responsibility of doing it right. It's not always done right.
Yeah.
And it's not always done correctly, but I think, even Alberta, like I hate that it's branded as the oil and gas province. It's like, no, it's an energy province is what it is.
Yeah.
And if you brand it that way, like we're all trying to work towards a better tomorrow.
Yeah.
And like the mantra that like I live, and it's a philosophy I live my life by, and we're trying to extend that into Pod Summit and everything, is the idea of leave it better than you found it.
Yeah.
And there's aspects of the industry that you could argue that we're not doing that, but on the flip side of it too, you can say like what we do allows for innovation and technology and this drive to be better, sustainable, and do the transition that we need and that should happen down the road. It's allowing all that to happen, and so everything happens kind of progressively, and everything is scalable, but it takes time. Like we can't just snap our fingers and turn the whole thing off.
Yeah, no, 100%. But anytime I get to talk to a geologist, I always, because like I said, like the people that I went to U of C, and then I went to U of A to graduate, but I went to business school. But I met just a ton of people in that group, and they were always the people most connected. Like they were the ones that loved camping. They were voted most likely to hug a tree, all that stuff. So I always find that interesting. And it's a perspective that I don't think a lot of people outside of maybe Alberta or outside of the industry truly can appreciate. Is like you're dealing with a lot of people that grew up loving the earth, and I think still do to a huge degree. So one of the things you said as far as advice goes is try everything and don't be afraid of failure, which I think applies to podcasting for sure, because you're going to fall on your face and look like an idiot and all that sort of stuff. What do you think of the word, like, how do you define failure? Like when you say like, don't be afraid of failure, what does that mean to you?
Well, failure is a tough word because I almost don't like that word failure. I like the idea of learning. Like, don't be afraid to do something and don't be afraid to learn. Like we commonly associate failure with not accomplishing something, not accomplishing a goal, but in every failure, quote unquote failure, there's learnings in it. Yeah. And so I fully expect with Pod Summit that we're going to have learnings. Like I'm not going to call them failures because you don't know otherwise. And you have to experiment. You have to do things that are outside of your comfort zone, outside of that box, to understand like what the right path is. And so trying to put yourself into a box when you do anything in your life, like this is the way I'm going to do it, it's never going to shake out like that. Yeah. Like the plan you make today is going to get demolished tomorrow. Yeah. Like, and that's why even Gantt chart, I don't like any of that stuff because like the moment you make it, it's already out of date. Yeah. And so this idea of failure, I don't believe that we can fail. I believe that we learn from that. There's successes and there's learnings, and like failures is a word that we commonly associate with like the inability to achieve a goal. Right. But it's just a piece of the puzzle that you add to build on to get to that next step. Yeah. No, and I totally agree. When you look at what you do, whether it's in your career or whether it's your new venture with the summit, have you had people in your life that you look to as mentors? Like personally, yeah. Like it's one of those things because you always reflect back and you always want like a hero. You always want someone that you can point your finger at and be like, that is the person I want to be. Yeah. And I never really had that. Like I've always felt that, okay, this is this void. Like, where's the person that I want to be? And I've kind of looked at it in two ways. I kind of looked at it that, okay, that means that I just need to forge my own path. Like I want to be my own person. I don't have someone that I say specifically, I want that person's life. I want that person's job. Right. I want to just follow in their footsteps. I'm kind of always wanted to carve my own way. But I always reflect back to my parents, to be honest with you. Like I grew up in a small town, small community, and I think that's a big reason why community is so important to me. But just the way that they approach life, it was just really about providing a great place to grow up, to excel. And they always pushed me. They said, you don't really have a choice. You're going to university. And like I was the first one in my family to go to university. And they said, well, so why was that important to them then? If you were the first one, it just like usually when they say you're going to university, it's like a defined path. Yeah. It's like everybody does it. You're going to be a doctor. Shut up. Like, so why was it important
for them to see you go to university?
They just wanted me to have all the options on the table.
Yeah.
Like to have the ability to go and just learn.
Yeah.
Learn how to learn at university. Go find yourself, but do it through getting a higher education.
Yeah.
I think that because like I mentioned, they're both entrepreneurs, and I think they look back and say, there's things I wish I had in my life, like the ability to have just benefits, to have the ability to just pick up one day and go on vacation, forget about my work. As an entrepreneur, you don't really ever forget about your work. So you're always plugged into it. And so I think what they wanted for me was the ability to leave the small town and go explore and discover the world and kind of find myself. I think that was very important because my mom especially, they kind of lived in a very kind of small box. Like it was like they're Catholic and they had to do these certain things and they couldn't do this, they couldn't do that. And I feel like that she especially always wanted us to just go explore, figure out the world, and from there, then we'll excel.
Yeah.
And we've had that experience of just changing who we are and evolving as people.
Yeah. I love that because sometimes people want you to shrink to where they are, right? It's very refreshing when someone says, here's what my life experience is, but I want you to have more than that. And you know what I mean? Like a lot of times families pressure you to be like, I did this and it was good enough for me, so you should do this. Yeah. And like the idea that they kind of push you to be like, no, get the hell out of here.
Well, and my mom would love nothing more than for me to come back home and hang out with them more often.
Yeah.
They live far away and we got 2 kids and all that. And it's very difficult with the distance and all that. And I'd say that's probably like one of her like single regrets is that we don't see each other enough. Like I talk on the phone every day with my mom. Like we have a great relationship. Like talk to her like probably anywhere between like 5 minutes and 45 minutes a day.
Holy shit.
And
I don't.
And like and part of that is just because we have a really strong bond and connection. And part of it is it's just a consequence of me being away and having a family here and a life here. Like I think as of this year, I've spent equal amount of time in Ontario as in Alberta.
Oh yeah,
I'm getting
that's
to that,
always an
I'm getting that
important
weird threshold.
My cousin says that because he lived in Alberta, and then he lived in Saskatchewan, and now he lives in Ontario. And so every time he hits one of those like equilibriums where he's like, oh fuck, isn't that crazy?
Like, so it's like, how do I identify myself now? Am I Ontarian? Am I Albertan? Like I always go Canadian first.
Does the world revolve around Ontario or Calgary now?
I can tell you, even from like
for you though. Now you're like, maybe it's Calgary now. Yeah,
not anymore. I can tell you from growing up in Toronto that kind of ism of everything revolves around Toronto and Ontario is 100% true.
Yeah,
and that even a little bit is some of the push for Pod Summit too. If I could come back to that, is that a lot of the podcasting space is heavily concentrated in Toronto. Like the rest of the country doesn't exist.
Right.
There's hundreds and hundreds of podcasters and listeners in BC and Alberta. And they just released in 2022, like Alberta was the highest consuming population of podcasts, like from a listener perspective. And so there's so much to gain from all of that.
Yeah.
I think Toronto,
it's funny because my wife before we were married, was living in Toronto for a while, and I had never been there, and so I didn't know what to expect, but only getting like our, Western version of like what Toronto was, I kind of went with like a chip on my shoulder, and I loved Toronto, man. Like it was so cool, like because she was working all day, right? So I would just be like walking around, and it was springtime, so it was like really nice out. The Blue Jays would be playing, like there was like Toonie Tuesdays where I'd just go and watch a game and drink beer, and I'm just like, sorry, what about this sucks? Like I'm like, this is pretty rad.
It's funny you say that too, because like the thing about Toronto especially is that it has everything an American city wants, and like we don't all want to be American cities and all that, but like the fact you have NHL, NBA, Blue Jays, you have the accessibility to kind of like the Pearson Airport where you can go anywhere in the world. Everything funnels through Toronto to some degree. There's a lot of industry there. Everyone kind of centers this up because of the population and who's there. And so as a young person, as an entrepreneur, like I could see the appeal for wanting to be there.
Oh yeah, big time.
But then having grown up like my parents grew up in Toronto, and they specifically moved out of Toronto because they didn't want to raise a family in Toronto.
Right.
And so like I ended up in like the rural kind of cottage country of Toronto, which I would never have exchanged for a life in the city.
Oh no shit, that would have been
but,
awesome.
But it has all its benefits. It's like kind of like anywhere, right?
Yeah.
It's you you don't have the accessibility like you do here to the mountains, but you have the accessibility to kind of Europe. You can get to Europe in 6 hours.
Yeah. Yeah. I know it's, I do love it. I will say, yeah, like Toronto is, I mean, but I love Calgary. When you talk about entrepreneurs and support for that, I think, and I don't know, I've never lived in Toronto. I've never worked in Toronto, but I would say Alberta is about as supportive of entrepreneurs as you can get. Like I've never had a venture that I've done. I've been an entrepreneur my whole life that, you know, I get immediate support almost always by like a pretty cool group of people. You know what I mean? Like there's never like, what? That's so dumb. Like it's just like, cool, man. What do you need? You know? And I think that there's just that built in, that's the culture of Calgary. So anytime you can kind of get into that vibe, no matter what city, if you can get into that community, it's awesome.
Well, I found my way into that community, you know, and like that's how I met you, and it's so embracing because I'm like I said, I'm like 6 months into this entrepreneur journey. So
Yeah,
like I'm still like a big time rookie on this, and so, but I have found myself in a space where I'm meeting a lot of cool people that are like, yeah, hey, we've been doing this our whole lives, or we've been doing this for 15 years.
Yeah,
like, here's some advice. Like, let me hear your pitch. Let's talk about your elevator pitch and all this. It's been like really like that's probably been one of the best things for me, like personally, mentally, and all that, is having exposure to so many cool people that are just willing to be like, hey, yeah, let's go out, let's have a beer and let's chat.
Totally. And I think that's why your podcasting summit is that's why I'm excited for it to be in Calgary, because I think there'll be a real community that will be supportive of it. You had what was I? Oh yeah, so you're talking about owning a business pod summit, but you said that you describe yourself as risk adverse, which was just so funny because like having met you, having talked to you, and then talking about like the pod summit, and then having you describe yourself as risk adverse, I was kind of like, I don't know, man. Maybe he lacks self-awareness, because that doesn't seem like risk adverse. So what do you mean when you're like on what level are you risk adverse?
I'd say more on the financial side of life in general. Like it's funny, I can go back to the idea of marriage here, or maybe bring it up for the first time.
Just wait. This is where I would potentially edit the podcast.
This is where it comes up. No, my wife and I are complement each other so well in this space, because I'm like super fiscally conservative, and she's like, I'm going to push you outside of your comfort zone a little bit on this one. Let's spend a little extra and do this trip. And then you get back and you're like, hey, that didn't break us. And it was a ton of fun. And she has this ability to kind of like trick me into making decisions where it's like, especially financially, she's like slowly seeds this. And then I'm like, hey, I have this idea. And she's like, okay, I had that idea 6 months ago.
But she probably only tells you that after it's
100%.
By the way,
100%.
that was my idea.
And she's like, we talked about this 6 months ago, and this was kind of originally where I wanted to go. So I'd say like on a risk aversion, it's more like kind of a financial piece.
Right.
And so it's always trying. This comes from growing up with 2 entrepreneurial parents that, didn't make a ton of money. We lived very modestly, and, I paid for everything growing up for when I got to university and all that.
Yeah.
So I've always been just like fiscally conscious. Is where their risk aversion comes into. And like this opportunity, like I've been looking for an opportunity like this forever. And I've always had the comfort of my career, and I've always enjoyed my career, and this was just really something that for the first time that it kind of, because we bought Pod Summit from like the intangible assets, the name, the logo, the kind of the concept off of a guy named Ernest, who had run it in Calgary and Edmonton for a couple of years, 2017, 18, 19. And I reached out to him, and we got chatting about some different stuff. And he kind of said, look, you seem like you're looking for something. I have this piece that I'm looking to kind of offload and get out of. Would you be interested? And I kind of turned around and said, like, light bulb moment, yes. And I didn't really even hesitate. Like my wife and I, of course, talked about it, but it just seemed like such a great opportunity and something that I couldn't pass up, and just kind of pulled the trigger on it. And it's the first time I've really done. I say that now, but like upon reflection, like I moved out to Calgary and I didn't know a single person out here. I picked up my whole life. Like and just like moved out here after getting a job, and like I picked up and just like went to university one day. And so maybe not, but I would say like it really, for me, it's like the financial side of it. Like I'm always looking for the best way to proceed. Like I wouldn't consider myself like a cheap person, but I would consider myself someone that likes to weigh options.
Yeah. It's just, I guess, what you define as risk, right? Like, you don't define obviously moving across the country to be a risk. You don't, and then so there's just, everybody defines risk differently, right? So it's interesting because, like I said, looking through everything, and it's like I consider myself risk adverse. I'm like, I don't know if he understands the definition of that, but okay, cool. So then your vision for Pod Summit, I don't know, maybe this is like this might fall under the category of none of my fucking business, but in terms of when you bought Pod Summit, because just based on what you said, so because a lot of what you bought was kind of an intangible, so why buy it instead of just being like, hey, cool idea, I'll do that, but I'm not buying it from you?
Yeah, I think some of it there's a bit of brand recognition there. And Ernest I had gone to a couple of the Pod Summits before, to the 2019 version of it. So there's a bit of brand recognition inside of Alberta. So that was one piece of it. We wanted something that didn't feel like it was brand new. Like, he had done some stuff with local podcasters in the past. There was, he had been on some like CBC and all that and talked to those people. So there's a bit of recognition there. He also had all like the digital assets, like the domain, all of the handles that weren't like Pod Summit _2 or something like that. Like, it was
6969.
Yeah, exactly. It was just a nice box of stuff that was like, everything is lined up here. So you had the Instagram, the Twitter, the Facebook page, all this kind of stuff, the domain, the .com domain. We had the .ca domain now, and it was kind of just and it was like, we ended up negotiating a very reasonable price for all of it. Had a logo set up that had a bit of brand recognition. And so we were looking to start something that was had moved forward and had a bit of foundation to it.
Right.
Was, instead of starting from scratch,
Totally.
we were able to say, okay, you were here before, or this person had spoken. You'd spoken at this in 2019. I'm the new owner. This is what we're trying to do. This is how we're trying to change and evolve it. And so, for people, it's just that little less of a hurdle to get over, because they kind of recognize it. And I really like the name. Pod Summit's a cool name. Yeah, we're trying to fundamentally move away from the idea of a conference, because I find conference and the word to be a bit stale. It feels stiff, and so we're trying to move towards event. But people then have a hard time wrapping their head around, like, are you just having like a meetup in a bar? Yeah. And trying to convey what it is has been a bit difficult. So I'd kind of interchangeably use the term event and conference right now. Yeah. But yeah, it was just about having something with a little recognition to it.
No, and that's awesome. As long as, like I was curious, but that all makes sense in terms of like, there's just a lot of assets that you get for it. And there's value in that. And then I'm sure you can probably call him up and say, hey, whereas if you just totally stole his idea, they probably wouldn't be as...
Well, and that's it. And like, this goes to like the idea of podcasting in general, right? It's about building on things. It's, you're never going to go and steal someone's, like, you might try to like ape something or look at a guy and say, I'm going to take inspiration from that. Yeah. But given how tight and small the podcast environment is in Alberta too, and even in Canada, I always thought, if I'm going to do this is someone I at least want to talk to about. Like, he could have said too, like, and Ernest is a great guy and he's doing different things now. He's moved out of Calgary and he started up other things. And, if I didn't, I would have always chatted to him. Even if he had said, I have no interest in selling this, I'm going to hold on to this and whatever. Yeah. I would have done and gone and started something else. But that's where I wanted to start, because I felt he had kind of established Pod Summit as the first Western Canadian podcast conference. And I felt like it's respectful to go out there 100%. Because it's such a small community that, people are like, oh, did you know about this? And you know what I mean? It's like, no, this is, there's some legacy here, which I kind of like.
And what's interesting is I feel like every community, when you get into it, you realize how small it is. So like small. Oil and gas would be the same thing. So like it seems from an outsider's perspective like this, like gigantic. It's like when you start walking down the plus 15s, it's just like
all the time.
Yeah, it's a small community. The beer community is small. Advice my friend gave me years ago is, play nice in the sandbox, right? Because
you never know.
It's easier, right?
Like your degrees of separation sometimes are like one person. Yeah. Like you kind of turn sour on some person. It's like, oh, all of a sudden it's like, oh yeah, but they're connected to this guy, and you're like, oh man, like there's a time and place, I think, for kind of button heads with people and all that. But ultimately, that concept and that idea of playing nice in the sandbox, because you're never more than like 2 degrees of separation, from, especially in this city. This is it's like a city of like 3 million people, but like everyone kind of knows everyone ish. And especially if you get like into these spaces, whether it's the entrepreneur space, the oil and gas space.
Oh, totally.
Everyone kind of
because then it just shrinks by like,
boom, 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 like exponentially.
Yeah, 100%. Well, yeah, that'd be a good podcast though. As you were saying that, it's like two people that don't get along, you know, maybe in the same space or whatever, you know, and just like put them on a podcast and like we'll just like we'll Maury Povich it. We'll like make him hash it out on the podcast.
Sometimes that's like, even when doing the nerd room, sometimes like we would purposely take opposing views. Like we'd take I at one point had 4 co-hosts, and it'd be, people sometimes like to hear arguments, like not arguments for the sake of it or like mean-spirited arguments, but like opposing views, different views, debate as to like why this is good and why this isn't good. And so that does make for interesting podcasting.
Oh yeah, like if it was like the nerd echo chamber, that'd be
like,
the worst.
Yeah,
and Klingons are the best. Yes, I agree. Klingons are the best. Like it's just like, okay, cool. What's next?
It's just, and then it becomes this monotonous, monotone sort of podcast where it's just like, this person says yes, this person, and just, this is boring. Like, you need a little bit of that. Especially when you have co-hosts, you need a little bit of that adversity built into it, because it creates an interesting conversation. Because, like I said before, you go out in real life, like everyone's got an opinion on something. Like, not everyone is just like high fives and rainbows. Like,
no, for sure. Those are the best. Well, and it's funny too, because sometimes people perceive those as arguments, right? And it's like, no, I'm just playing the devil's advocate so that we can get a perspective here. You know what I mean? Like it's more fun that way.
Exactly. And like there's a difference between like arguing and having a debate. Which I think people get mixed up on that sometimes, where it's like you can have opposing views, but you can also still be friends. Like we could have very different political leanings. But you can have a conversation and also still be friends. Like, that doesn't define you. That one position that you take. Unless it's super racist or something. Like
I have a friend that like we see each other say once a year, and if we're together for a couple nights, one of those nights like we actually almost both know that we're going to just have like that conversation, because we actually find it fun. Like, you know what I mean? And like we'll like talk about politics or talk about something that's like totally taboo, and everyone else kind of like, you know, kind of gets out of the room. But like for us, we're just like, no, because it's fun. Like, I know that he's an awesome human being. So like if he doesn't align with what my perspectives are on those things, it challenges me, because then I think, well, okay, I love this person. So what about what he's saying, you know, can I agree with, because I know that he comes from a good place. You know what I mean? And so it's really good when you fundamentally know that the person you're discussing this with is a good person, and then you can have those contrasting ideas. It's like, okay, well, that's not, you know, the devil. So like, and then it becomes fun as far as I'm concerned, you know?
And it's important to have debates. Like if you're in this, like you said before, like this echo chamber where everyone is just agreeing on everything, like
because they have to, because they're scared not to,
and we'd never get anything done. You'd never innovate. You'd never create if you were just, everyone would like the same thing. And so when you're doing it with someone that you respect and that you love, or it's a friend or whatever, it also makes you think and you reflect. Because
100%.
You can get in, whether it's through algorithms on social media or through it's associated with a particular type of person, you can get into a space where you don't hear what's going on. And so you don't have the ability to evolve and change your opinion, because like, I think the big thing, you're allowed to change your opinion. You're allowed to evolve that. You don't have to take a position and stick to that.
And it's so funny because you see that in politics sometimes, where it's like, well, look at 10 years ago, they thought this, and like they're flip-flopping. It's like, so wait, they've changed their opinion over a decade? Like that's reasonable. Like that's, you know, like new information came in.
Exactly.
And I changed my idea, my opinion. And it's just like, wow, you can't do that. It's like, we should definitely be able to do that.
You should be encouraging that. Every day to rethink and question and critically think. Like that's, I think, a skill set that is being lost. Is the ability to be like, okay, I'm going to take that information. I don't particularly agree with it. I'm going to take it and think about it a little bit. And that's what like a guy like Joe Rogan does really well. Is like his biggest podcast on planet Earth, and you call him a controversial figure or whatever. But he has the ability to kind of pull in information and say, "Oh, I don't agree with you, but let's talk. Let's hash this out and see." and then it might make other people think.
Yeah.
Like that's like his podcast is kind of about that. And like you can argue whether or not you agree with him, but
No. But I completely believe that he comes from a perspective of curiosity. I really do. And I don't think that he's ideological in the sense that there's things he's not willing to change.
Yeah.
If you can present a good argument,
he will.
and he will ask the questions to help you present your argument. Like that's I think like that's the crux of podcasting, is that you can actually have real conversations in a long format, right? Like it's not okay, we're up against the clock here. It's just like there's no clock that we're up against. Like say what you need to say, take as long as you need, to say it, kind of thing. I think that's the important thing. So when you look at the Pod Summit, the vision for it, like let's look at like, what defines success year 1, what defines success year 3, and then year 5.
I think year 1 is the execution piece of it. Like we're very focused on being able to execute with or without, like we would love a great sponsor to come in and support this and all that. But we've said we're doing this even in the absence of sponsors, because this year for us is about proving ourselves.
Yeah.
And proving that we can deliver a product, that we can deliver a production that is accepted and is embraced, and it becomes a focal point for people, like where they want to be there. Like we're trying to create something that people are excited about and they leave inspired.
Yeah.
And so that to me is where we find success. It's this, we can fill the room and people leave with the ability to do more. Like if you've ever been to a conference or a leadership conference, or you've seen someone speak on stage or whatever, and you leave and you feel you're just vibrating with a creative energy, like that's what I see as success. Is that we're able to inspire people, whether it's to start a podcast or scale their podcast, or they had one great conversation that they took something away from, that they can tweak their podcast or their story and get it out there. That to me is success in that.
Or finally have the courage to create their own their own podcast.
And sometimes that's going to take the encouragement of seeing people get up on stage and talk. And take that next step. That to me, that's what I want out of this fundamentally, is to inspire people. And I also want it to be a place where people feel comfortable coming and just expressing themselves, and creating that place where Canadian podcasting can kind of start to find a bit of a broader based footing.
So then moving, this is in Calgary in 2024. Is this is Calgary its permanent home, or is your vision that maybe this is a show you take on the road?
I'd like to see it on the road in the future. Like Calgary will likely be its home for a couple of years, because it's the ease of execution for us, being a very small shop.
Being risk adverse, don't want
right. But I'd love to take it to like Vancouver. I'd love to take it to Toronto. I'd love to go to the East Coast and do something in Halifax or something like that, because the difficult part about Canada is it's so big and it's so expensive to travel. And so the expectation of having people, like a ton of podcasters that live in Halifax or wherever, come out for this, it might be unattainable, especially if you're a hobbyist podcaster just trying to find your space. And so like down the road, for sure, I'd love to see this go to like Pod Summit YVR, Pod Summit YYZ, like just expand that piece of it and kind of solidify what we need to do here, and make those mistakes here and get those learnings, and then pull it out and be something much bigger.
No, it's exciting. When I was first introduced to you, I literally like not knowing, what it was all about, to learn about what your vision is. It's exciting, because for me, I don't do my podcasting personally at this point for I don't, my reason was never to make money, to monetize it. My reason was like when you were saying like, when people are vibrating like with excitement, like, sometimes I get to meet people and the conversations that I have are so exciting. And I would leave going, man, like I can never, like, how do I share that conversation with people? Like, how do I introduce that person to other people? Because I had no forum to do that. Like for me, that was podcasting to me. Is just like, because through what I do for work, I feel like I get to meet so many cool people that are truly passionate about what they're doing. Mm-hmm. And to me, that's what podcasting is like, how do we give these people that are doing amazing things in our community kind of a platform to share their story? Yeah. You know what I mean? And that's what it is all about, right?
Yeah. And like, you're versed in that, man. Like you've done this for years and years and years with Beer Fest. You're able to kind of pull this together, pull a community together, and build a similar thing, right? Where you're just kind of amplifying these different.
Yeah, it's a different medium.
It's different, a different medium,
different but medium. I want to like that. But again, like the biggest thing, like, you know, and going back to Calgary being such a pro entrepreneurial community. Not to say that other communities aren't. I just know firsthand that Calgary for sure is. You know, so many people help me succeed, mm-hmm. and it's just so cool to be able to, like, you know, when I get to meet these people that own, you know, restaurants and breweries and distilleries, and like, if there's anything that we can do to kind of help amplify, and then, yeah, to me, like, that's what podcasting was, is like another avenue to just keep doing that. You know what I mean? Yeah. And it's so much fun. So to give for what you're doing, to give people that forum to learn about it, to maybe get the courage to do it themselves, because it takes courage. You know what I mean? It's you look like an idiot. Like, you're going to look like an idiot. You have to get over that fact
every time, especially like I said earlier, when you're just speaking, and if you're like, people do solo I've done solo podcasts before. Really? And you're just sitting in your basement and you're speaking into a microphone. There's no reactions. You don't really, you're playing off of your own words, and you're trying to follow threads. And
I think that would be the hardest thing. I remember my friend Jim Button, he was one of my mentors. We were doing a conference, we were doing a conference call once, because we were doing our festival in Jasper, and he was supposed to be one of the guest speakers, but he was dealing with terminal cancer, and so he wasn't feeling healthy enough to be there in person. So we were doing this, but he was still speaking to an audience, and he did a great job. And so afterwards, I was talking to him, and I was just like, "Hey, man," he's like, "How did I do?" And I'm like, "What are you talking about? You did awesome. Like, it was rad." And he's like, because I didn't have the audience there, I couldn't see how they were reacting. Mm-hmm. It was kind of him talking to a screen. Yeah. And so, yeah, I can't even imagine how challenging it is. Because at least with this, I have you to, like, when I'm rambling on, you're just like, you got to fucking, you're derailing, my friend.
There's some people that, like, so at my work and all that, I planned conferences for a couple of years during the pandemic. And so we had a lot of virtual keynote speakers come in. Yeah. And they were phenomenal. Like, we had Dr. Jody Carrington came in, and like a lot of people talking about mental health and all of these different aspects of business, but they were literally in their, like, houses in a room similar to this, just talking to a screen to 200 plus people and getting no reactions. Yeah. Like, you're telling jokes, and there's like, there's no way to gauge, like, was that a bad joke? Was it a good joke? Like, it's a skill set, and it takes time to evolve that.
And it takes, first of all, the courage to do it, because then you can evolve it. Same as anything. Right. So the same as the Pod Summit is, start with the base of having done it, and then you can evolve and improve it, right? That's what it's all about. So yeah. Cool, man. Well, anything